So the name of the game is build, bridge, convert, get the money back, do it again.
Repeat.
Have you been thinking about buying your first rental property for some time, or do you already own a bunch of properties? Well, fellow investors, you found the right location to listen and learn from others' successes. Welcome to The Very Real Estate Effect with your host, Axel Mont-Saint-Jean.
Hello, and welcome back to the Very Real Estate Effect podcast, a show dedicated to real estate investing right here in Quebec. Today, it's a pleasure and an honor to have my friend Cory Friedman, Vice President of Lemire Property Management. Hi, Cory.
Hi, Axel. How you doing?
Very good, very good. Last week, you mentioned that in your experience in property management, you saw an increase in purpose-built building for rental. And this week, I was hoping we'd take a little bit of time because you're right, that's like a huge trend that's been happening, and kind of wanted to understand from you what you've seen in the past and how did we get here, some of the challenges and implications with such properties and managing them, and also where is the future going, because you have a very good pulse on the market, managing over 3,500 units here in the Montreal market. So first of all, like, when did you start to see this type of asset class being more and more widespread?
Listen, you don't have to drive far. You take a trip in your neighborhood, you're going to see cranes and sites and rental buildings being propped up left, right, and center. But really, where it started was probably 5 years ago, maybe a little bit before COVID. But really, once pandemic hit, it kind of amplified, right? I think what you have to do is you have to zoom out and you have to consider what's happening at a macro level.
Yeah.
And first thing you have to look at is obviously the immigration numbers and the number of people that are coming into Canada over the last 5-10 years have been astronomical. And what has happened is that when you combine that with the slow process that is development, right, from zoning to construction to lease up, like you could be sitting on a site for several years until you actually put up a tower. You saw a very big housing supply shock, right? Like housing shortage. And what ended up happening is that developers in all different asset classes, whether it was retail, office, condos, started to realize that this was inevitable, that this macro was happening. And everyone said, these are enterprising people. People are in the business of making money, and saying it is now the most profitable, or makes the most viability, or makes the most sense to start building these purpose-built rentals to meet this housing shortage, right? And you have people who are lifetime condo developers who are now not building to sell, but building to rent.
Exactly.
You have lifetime office and retail or strip mall developers who are saying, oh, well, the land that we now own, we're zoning it for multifamily, and we're zoning it for 6 floors and 150 units and 3 phases, right? And it's all to address the critical housing crisis that we have.
Yeah. Thank you for going back a little bit into the past to explain, because you're right. Like, it seems like maybe in the 2000s, it was all about condos and big buildings, selling those units individually. Then it became, depending also on the size of the developer, like, or the real estate investor, a lot about plexes and optimizations.
Yes.
Now, okay, that's great, but that means that you're taking an existing asset and you're repositioning it, whether it's a 2, 4, 5, 6, 12, 16, 24, but then it kind of stops there. And then, as you said, there was a huge influx in terms of population and growth, even though now the government is committed to slowing down a little bit, but that's still going to take some time to seep in. There's that shift towards, hey, I'm going to build some buildings where I'm just going to rent the units. I'm not going to sell them. I'm going to keep operating. Now, you being on the receiving end and managing some of those properties, obviously you saw an evolution when it came to the owners and their expectations, and also to some of the advantages that such property has. So can you kind of walk us through what you see? Why is it that the owners love those property types so much?
And I'll start this by saying, we built our business on the plexes and the smaller buildings and the older generation of buildings. So a couple of years ago, when we started getting involved in these newer assets and these new construction rentals, we realized it's a completely different business, right? It is, you cannot compare. There are so many differences in terms of renter profile, owner expectations, commitment, time spent, what you're allocating your resources towards, and kind of what is the natural flow of an annual or seasonal basis. So we'll start with the owners, right? So obviously everybody is looking to make as much money as possible in the shortest amount of time as possible. So a lot of times what happens is you have these developers that are going to find these sites, right? They're going to get the plans and they're going to get the city's approval and they're going to start building on construction loans, right? And the idea is to get to a stabilized income level, meaning whether it's 90 or 95% occupied, so that you can actually convert your construction loan to a traditional financing on the property. And the idea is, depending on how long it takes you to build, what the cost is to build, what the rental prices you can get, and how fast you can achieve stabilized NOI or stabilized rents will determine how much of your initial capital you can actually recoup on the transfer of bridge financing or construction loan to traditional CMHC or other loans, right? So the name of the game is build, bridge, convert, get the money back, do it again.
Repeat.
And what the beautiful thing is, if you do it right, you end up having these mega assets that you have very low cost base on, that now you have the next 50 years, if you so please, to generate cash flow, to generate refinancing opportunities, and to have asset appreciation at an extremely low cost base, right? And everyone's going to look at IRRs and return rates. And at the end of the day, if you invest in something and 3 years later you get all your money back, it's an unlimited IRR because you have no investment, right? You have no net cost base. So that's really the rinse and repeat, not so similar to the BRRRR method, right? Like you buy, you renovate, you refinance, you repeat. It's all about limiting your cost base or reducing your invested exposure, and all while giving the opportunity to multiply the physical assets that you have with that initial investment.
And how quickly you can make that cycle go through so you can wash and repeat. Now, sometimes there is the incentive to, as you described so well, to stabilize the property as quickly as possible and to walk away from your construction bridge and stabilize your financing. Now, there could be the incentive to give out, 1 or 2 free months of rent to attract tenants to move in, as long as you sign a lease. There could be incentives to lower the standards in terms of selection of tenants. Now, you are on the operating side, and then you have to deal with it. So I think it's not uncommon to see up to like a 30% turnover after the first year. Obviously, that puts a lot more strain on your system and your services. How do you go about it, and what kind of advice? This is a twofold question. What kind of advice do you give owners who want to stabilize quick, but at the same time they got to think of year 2 and 3?
So very good question, and it's a very interesting game to play. And I would say that the game lasts 5 years. Why do I say 5 years? Because in Quebec, you have 5 years once you put up a new building and the first tenant occupies it, where you're not subject to any rent control. So this means that your first 5 years, you don't have the TAL, you don't have expenses that are going to drive increases. You really have the freedom to say, okay, my first 5 years is where by the end of year 5, I better be beating my expectations or a top of where I projected in year 1. Now, how you get there? Many different ways to skin a cat. And it always comes back to, what are the objectives, right? The owners or the developers or whoever's put up the capital, right? What is their objective? Is their objective to get the money back faster, or is it to get more money back later. Right? So really you have to play with this game, and there's a lot of different layers to it, right? Because we want to lease up the building, and like everything in the world, it's all supply and demand. When you have 100 units up for sale, you need a lot more demand to generate. When you're down to your last couple of units, right, you're not as pressed to, be flexible on the price because you have more patience, right? So what you happen to see a lot is that pre-construction or pre-lease up, people are putting out promotions, whether it's 1 month free, 6 months free parking, 2 months free, and driving a lot of early momentum on the lease up through the incentivized leasing. Now, these leases are going to be maybe 14 months with 2 months free or 13 months with 1 month free, right? So you want to try, what's important is to never try and amortize that discount, because you want to train your residents to pay that monthly nut in rent, because when it comes to renewal and we're saying, okay, your rent was, $2,400, but you had 2 months free, and now we're increasing you only $25. Even that small increase is an effective 20 to 30% increase when you calculate the net rent after incentives or promotions, which leads to, like you said, that high turnover, especially in the first few years, where you have plexes and other lower class assets. You're going to have single digit percentage turnover. In these new construction builds, you're going to see 30%. And when you over incentivize, you're going to see 40%, right? So you want to be, for natural things, right, the natural way of the new construction, you want to be a 25 to 30% turnover, just because although we talked about all these immigration coming in and all these the shortages, at the end of the day, like, these are not the most affordable housing solutions. No. These are the highest rental value solutions. And although there are more and more people who need rentals, the number of those who can afford the upper echelon of, condo lifestyle, amenity lifestyle, there's a disconnect, right? So, it kind of brings to that point of tenant selection criteria is, well, you can't be everything to everyone. You can't lease up the building quick, but also have crazy high expectations on tenant selection criteria, and also be very stringent on price and promotion. So it's a lot of different elements that you're balancing to try and meet, once again, what's the objective? What is your timeline? What is, your target? And this is going to be a game you're going to play in the first 2-3 years of that 5-year window. And hopefully the goal is that you have a mix of a little bit of everything. You need the people who are on the promotions to get the volume. You need the people who are properly vetted, who you can have the renewals and you don't have the bad debt, you don't have the evictions, but you're going to have a little bit of everything because you have so many units to fill, and you may be against the clock, or you may have certain partners or investors or whatnot that need money back, or that want to get their money back and want to reinvest it in the next project or the next phase or the next alternative investment. So
and to try to take out, and yet, as you said, it's a fine balancing act.
Yeah. I wish there's no like magic recipe, but I think that understanding all of these different elements gives you the best position to do a case-by-case approach and say, okay, this is a yellow flag application, but we're still early in the process. We need to fill up, they want a unit that maybe is not as popular. It's a different square footage. It doesn't have the window view, right? And that's the thing also with the new construction is you have in-demand units and you have maybe not so in-demand units. So, if you're a first-time builder or developer, you may not have the expertise or, the pain in knowing, hey, these like weirdly configured units or these higher square footage units, they don't perform as well on the market from like a dollar per square foot, or a recovery of your dollar per square foot cost. So like it takes time to systemize and to understand that these are the right blends of units, and you may be forced by the city that you're working with to provide certain layouts or provide certain specs, parking, amenities, right? So there's a lot to dive in with the new construction purpose-built rentals.
It is, and actually, this is a good segue towards the implication that the property management has with regards to the design of the building. So do you sometimes with your clients have the opportunity to sit down earlier on in the process in the design phase to be like, hey guys, if you plan this, remember that for the property management, that means that. Like, how does that go? And what kind of contributions can you make?
So it's a mix, right? No mandate is the same. Mm-hmm. You have mandates where they approach us and they say, hey, we're about to start our pre-leasing. This is where we want you to come in. And you have other situations where they haven't even put shovel in the ground and they want us involved to have those discussions and say, okay, these are the systems of the building that we're planning to do. Mm-hmm. Do you have experience with these systems? These are the unit specs. This is the parking ratio. These are the amenities. Like, these are the options, right? We have this space. Should we do it? Is it a community room? Is it an events room? Is it a WeWork room? This only comes from having the experience and being able to have a big enough sample size of different specs on different buildings so that you can compare apples and apples, right? Mm-hmm. If you have one project and you only know that one project, it's hard for you to say, well, what's happening in the 10 other projects that are similar or nuanced or different? So we're lucky enough to now have that sample size of different types of projects to have a little bit of a better understanding of, hey, just be careful for this, or this is a unintended consequence of these choices.
Exactly. And this is where now you have enough experience and scale to be able to see this. And once again, it's interesting that you mentioned, common spaces, because up until a couple of years ago, no one thought about doing some co-working spaces in multifamily residential building, whereas now it's almost a standard to have almost a business center downstairs. And so are there certain amenities that you, for example, have seen like people have built and they never get used and it's actually a waste of space?
It doesn't matter if they get used or not. It's all about being offered. Mm-hmm. The key here is that what's the biggest difference on these properties is the size of the units. The units are smaller, the bedrooms are smaller, and people are okay with that because they're marketed in a way that we're giving you a lifestyle in this building. You have a gym, you have a pool, you have a rooftop terrace, you have storage and indoor parking. So people forget that they can't put a queen size bed in their second bedroom, or they can't, put a 65-inch TV on their living room wall because they're living in a condo style smaller unit. So whether or not the amenities get used, being offered is almost more important from a marketing standpoint, from a selling and leasing standpoint, right? Like, wow. It's human psychology that, like, hey, I don't like to swim. I know how to swim, but if you tell me there's a pool on the rooftop, I'm going to value it more than if there's not, because I'm going to say, wow, maybe this is the apartment where I'm going to start to swim, right? Yeah. Or maybe this is the apartment where I'm going to start going to the gym or whatnot, So, and I think what the next level operators or the creative operators are taking those amenities and trying to find affiliate programming or different ways to bring in programming or trainers or whatnot as extra community building, right? It's all about this idea of, we're not selling you an apartment, we're selling you a community, right? And it's, we have affiliated restaurants, we have affiliated service trades,
cooking
dog
classes.
Walkers, cooking classes, swimming lessons, yoga classes, right? Now, this is all good and it's a way to create this ancillary revenue. Obviously, it takes the right network, the right systems to manage it, right? And but it just shows you the way the trends are going, where people, when they're building, they're thinking about this. They're not, they're not necessarily thinking about, okay, is this the best actual unit for my residents, but they're thinking about the entire building envelope and what can it offer in terms of providing a community or a lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. I love what you said in terms of, it doesn't really matter if it's used or not. It's the perceived value of the fact that it's offered.
Yeah.
You're so spot on. Wow. It doesn't really matter whether people use the gym or not, as long as they perceive that it's a great building because a gym is offered. And as you said, that might be the apartment they live in that they're going to get healthier. That's where the sale happens.
You also got to realize that there's a competitive landscape, right? So, there could be 3 buildings being put up all within a couple months, and they're all going to be looking for the same dollar per foot, right? So if I'm comparing, if I don't care geographically to live 2 or 3 or 4 blocks away, and all things being equal, I'm now going nitty gritty and evaluating, okay, well, this one has a pool and a gym, but that one has a pool, a gym, a rooftop terrace. This one I actually can get an electric vehicle parking, right? Like these are all little nuances to the perception of the luxury, the perception of the offerings, and also the competitive nature, because there are so many of these new projects going up.
Yeah. Wow, thank you very much, Corey. Very insightful. I'm grateful that you're sharing your knowledge and market view with us today and our audience. Thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, appreciate it. Super happy and excited to talk about it. I think that it's very relevant, and maybe even if you have the 10plex or the 6plex, it's not your speed, but it's very important to have a well-rounded view of the market as a whole. So even though, like, when you have your Plex and you want to retrofit it or improve it, you got to consider that, hey, I don't have the amenities to compete with the new site down the street. So you have to really play in your design, in your renovations, in your marketing that, hey, you could fit a king size bed in this room, or, you actually have, a window or like there's natural lighting that you could actually have a home office that doesn't actually replace your couch in your living space. So like there's different ways now that you have to think because of this new market trend that's emerging.
Yeah, and to identify a more unique feature that gets turned into a selling point.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for this wisdom, Corey. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you very much for listening. As usual, share this episode with a friend who could benefit from this conversation, and keep researching your market, make some offers. We'll talk to you next week. Thank you.